equity, mate.
I will say this about investing. Everything you do learn is cumulative. What I learned at 20 is useful.
Welcome to another episode of Equity Mates, a podcast that follows our journey of investing. Whether you're an absolute beginner or approaching Warren Buffett status, our aim is to help break down your barriers from beginning to dividend. My name is Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you?
I'm very good, Bryce. Very excited. We are still in Owen's studio. He hasn't kicked us out yet, and we are here for the third part of our Value Investor series.
That's it. If you are just joining us, over the last two episodes, we've discussed what is value investing and the different ways that you can value stocks. Second episode was the valuation of zero, taking the framework that you can learn in the Value Investor program. And then today we are actually going to unpack Apple and talk about the valuation. And to do it, we are joined by Owen again. Owen, welcome.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure to be here.
If you've been on the fence about deciding to join the course, by the end of this episode, guaranteed that you will want to join. But remember, there is $100 off for a limited amount of time. You can use the code MATES, M-A-T-E-S. Those details are all in the show notes, and then you'll be able to do the course and follow along and start building out some of the models that Owen and Ren have been referring to throughout this series. So MATES, $100 off for a limited time. Information in the show notes. All right, well, we all know what Apple is.
Yeah, I was going to say, we spent about 10 minutes talking about Xero's business model. Let's say we know what Apple is. Yeah.
But the business model has changed over time. So when you're building an investment thesis, what are the assumptions that are going into you creating an investment thesis for Apple?
Yeah, you make a great point just quickly about it being a massive business. That means that the valuations are often tighter, meaning that so many analysts are covering it. So the chance of getting a seriously undervalued investment is very slim because there's so much information out there. So when it comes to assumptions, you basically have to have a variant perception. You have to have a reason why you think everyone's wrong. And it has to be pretty strong when it comes to a blue chip like Apple. I remember a few years ago, we've talked about him a little bit on the show, but my inspiration for value investing comes from Joe Mager, who's now back in the United States. And I remember I said on Twitter that Apple's like one of my best large cap company ideas. And he then had another tweet, maybe like a week or something later, saying that I just don't see it. And I was like, whoa, this scared me because here's the guy that I'm like, this is my God, saying I don't get it. And I'm like, well, okay. So the basic idea is that the business model has shifted dramatically over time. So once you go Mac, you never go back is the saying. Well, you get this Mac, then you get the watch, then you get the Apple iPhone, and you just continue down that path. Now, what we know and what we see in front of us is hardware. And the actual hardware of Apple, the diehards are going to hate me for this, is not that different to Microsoft products or like a Toshiba or like a Dell PC. It's really not that different. Like they run on a CPU, they have a GPU, blah, blah, blah. But the difference is the software. So the software is that iOS software we know and love. It's secure, it's safe, it's like private, it's encrypted, it's all that stuff. And it's the same across every device. And that is what keeps people in the ecosystem. So Apple has taken that over the past, say, 5 to 8 years. It's taken that and it said, well, how can we flex this? How can we take that thing and put it everywhere in people's lives? So that then became a watch. It got the AirPods. It got everything in the ecosystem. And you know what? You can even get an Apple Music subscription to go with your AirPods for $3.99 a month. Well, that was when they promoted it. You don't even need to look at your iPhone anymore. When you put the AirPods in, it prompts you, right? And that's an example of how they can have this integrated circuit of apps and tools, and they can start pushing more software into your life. If you've got photos on your phone, you get that stupid notification. It's like, your iCloud is full. You need to upgrade. And then you click the button and it's literally like one button, you're done. And then instead of $2 a month, it's $10 a month. And that's what we call services revenue inside Apple. And so this is this software-only revenue that they're harvesting just by you using their products. And that is the big shift, and that was my variant perception. Early on when that business was nascent, like really, really small. In 2015, it was only 8% of revenue. That's up to 20% today. But take it in context, the business is also a lot bigger today than it was in 2015. So that's a lot of revenue coming through. And the profit margins are delicious.
So before we get to what it is today and where it's going to be in the future, or where you think it's going to be in the future, Did you ask Joe why he didn't say it?
Well, according to the Twitter and what I remember of it, it's basically that he didn't see that transition being very smooth. So like from hardware dependent, people at the time, I remember Steve Johnson, another great Australian investor from Forager Funds, he had this view that's like, how can people pay $2,400 for an iPhone? Surely this is tapped out. And he was probably right, to be honest. It kind of is tapped out. Like until they have like, I've got my my 12 Pro here. Until they went to 5G with the phone, I was not interested in upgrading. I was just going to like let my old thing die. But then I was like, faster internet. Like I can hotspot when I'm on the road. I was like, yes, got it. And so that's what we call a super cycle. And that happens probably every 4 years with Apple, where there's some sort of groundbreaking thing that you need on the phone and you get through it. And so so back to Joe's concern, from what I could tell, was it's just not going to transition that well. But if you take that super long-term horizon, you believed in that ecosystem, it's worked.
And I think, again, that's just a reminder that we keep hitting in this 3-part series that the challenge in valuation isn't in the maths, it's in accurately forecasting the future prospects of the business. So Joe and Owen would probably have a similar discount rate and would similarly, calculate, their spreadsheets would look very similar, but it's the assumptions that lead to the numbers being put in there that separates them. So let's get to the assumptions.
Yeah, so basically my assumptions out, and this was out to past 2030, was that the services revenue would be over 40% of the business. Now that's a huge thing. If you think, like I just said, 2015 was 8%. So you might think, okay, that's a big number, but let's just kind of think about that. Well, the profit margins on that revenue are north of 65%. Versus on the iPhones and stuff, you get it's like 30 to 40%. So you're doubling the profit that you get from this new service line, which is also growing 5-fold in, say, 10 to 15 years. And so that's where you start to get more and more and more profits, even if the business doesn't grow that fast. Most recent growth was around about 5 to 7% revenue growth. The services revenue did actually fall a bit, which is a bit concerning. But the key there was like, it's not growing as fast, but under the surface, like if you go and you pop the hood, you see that the business that is valuable, i.e. this services business, is actually still growing and it's more profitable. And that's the key thing. And that's the key thing that I watch going forward. And so Apple made this, just in terms of assumptions, Apple made this choice maybe 2 years ago now, where they said, we're not going to publish the number of iPhones that we sell, like the units anymore. And this was at a time when they'd just come out through a super cycle of these new iPhones, and it was obvious that the market was saturated with Apple iPhones. And they knew that they couldn't up last year's results. So they were like, we're going to drop this metric. And all the analysts were like, I remember this distinct quarterly call. It was actually like an hour of, so how are we going to do this? And the stock dropped because analysts are like, I don't know. Like, this is my assumption in my model. Like, what am I going to do? And to be honest, it is scary, because basically what it meant was that the key business that was inside Apple at the time, no one could be like, exactly that's how many units were sold. And so what they've done is sporadically, they've given us this other number, which is a bit blurry, which is installed base. Installed base is basically everything. So you could just have the Apple Watch or just the iPhone or just the Mac, which is not nearly as valuable as the how many Macs, how many iPhones, how many watches. And so that's where it gets a bit blurry. And that figure is currently 1.8 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's like installed base. I probably have 2 old iPhones sitting in a drawer that don't work, but like what I don't want to sell them. I can't sell them. I don't want to throw them out. And I haven't taken them to an electronics recycler. Do they count?
Yeah, well, they probably do. If they get switched on once that year, maybe they count. I don't know. And so that from a modeling perspective, what this means is that you have to basically drop that, and then you have to just take whatever was like last quarter or last year's results and just imply a growth rate, which is very blunt when it comes to modeling. You basically have to go, well, it was $100 billion revenue last year. I think it's going to grow at 10% because they'll increase prices 5% and they'll sell 5% more this year or something like that. And that's where it gets a bit hard to model and it becomes a bit blunt.
All right, Owen, let's pause there and take a quick break to hear from our sponsors.
So with a company like Apple, where you said at the start, it is so well covered that there are, you could just jump online and get models from some of the best investment banks around the world, best fund managers, and get a valuation probably across the board.
Yep.
So what are you doing in your model that you think they all have wrong, or are you just tinkering with yours from 5 years ago?
Yeah, so I just tinker with mine I probably only jump into it maybe every 6 to 12 months, like when there's something that would materially change the thesis. So some people model quarter to quarter, so because the US companies report quarterly. I don't do that because I feel like the more time you spend in your model, the more likely you are to make a change with your investment. So I try and limit my exposure, basically, like when you have your phone before bed, you limit your exposure. For me, it's about when there's something that headlines, like in a quarterly call or, in a media release, or even there's something in the industry, that's when it triggers me to be like, go back in. What was your assumption for that thing? Has it changed? And so, one of those things recently is slowing services growth. Now, you would expect that we don't need a new iPhone every year. Some people do that. But most of us, I think the average life is between 2 and 4 years before people upgrade again. And there's a lot of switches. Most of the new acquisitions for Apple are switches, people that come across from the other ecosystems like Android. But, for the services revenue, if that slows, that's concerning because that means that the current usage of the current fleet of iPhones and Apple products may be not as intended, like maybe not as expected. So I would expect that services revenue continues to grow double digits, probably between 10 and 20% over the next 5 years in order to justify a valuation that might be above what analysts are expecting.
Now, the challenge with services revenue is that it actually is so many different business units within Apple that's just rolled up into this one number. It's Apple Music, it's iCloud, it's... help me out here, guys.
TV.
What other subscriptions
Arcade.
are there? Apple TV, Arcade.
News.
Who uses Arcade?
Yeah.
Apple News, yeah.
Podcasts, potentially.
Oh, they have paid podcast subscriptions now, yeah. So it's all these different business units working on different things. And for Apple, when they report, they just give you a services number. It's not like we have X number of Apple Music subscribers and X number of Apple Arcade subscribers. So then when it comes to modeling it, how do you actually do that work? Because modeling a subscription business isn't that hard. We spoke about it with Zero. Yeah. It's Apple Arcade costs $4 a month and there's 1 million users, $4 million revenue a month. And then you do that for all of them. But if Apple aren't giving you a starting point, how do you even start saying, here are the service business lines, here's how much revenue they'll be making, here's how that rolls up?
Yeah, so there was a few, like, you remember how I said they dropped the iPhone units? Well, we know the revenue and we can see the prices on the shelf in the store. So we could estimate roughly how many units are being sold. So we can back the number out over time. With the services revenue, it's much harder because these are basically launching behind closed doors. Like Apple News, for example, launched when services revenue was already bundled together. There was never you couldn't ever see it separately like you could with the iPhone units. So basically what you rely on is you rely on a lot of like industry reports and surveys and these types of things that come through either investment banks or they come through like Bloomberg. Bloomberg had this story probably about a year ago now where one of the things was like how much Google is paying to Apple to be installed in the...
to be the default search engine on the iPhone. Yeah.
Like the Internet Explorer back in the heyday for Microsoft. And that estimates are that could be as high as 50%. Now, I don't think it's that high at the moment, but that's a huge number if it's true.
Wait, what do you mean 50%?
Like of services revenue.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so that I don't think it's that high, but that could be something that we're looking at. Now, if there's a legal stoush or there's some sort of like regulation that comes in and says you need to give users more choice, well, then maybe what happens? And that's probably more of a scary thing for, everyone else. I think for most people, like you want to have some understanding of that. They do disclose the number of subscribers. So they do disclose that I think it's about 800 million subscribers at the moment. So that's a huge number.
And to be clear, if Bryce subscribes to Arcade Music, Apple TV, he's counted 3 times.
Yeah, exactly. They have the bundle, Apple One, where you can bundle everything together. But again, in that instance, like, are they making more or less money? The family members could have something else. I think, like for me, I think I paid $1.99 for iCloud, but I also have Apple Music. So, I'd probably consolidate so that the actual number of subscribers probably doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, because otherwise that's 10% of the world.
Yeah, it'd be crazy. It'd be crazy. And like to be honest, it's it's probably like those things where you get through like a trial, you get like the Apple Music, you get this, you get that. So who knows what's counted there, but you can use that. If you get that sporadically throughout the year, you get a number here or there. You can take that and you can be like, well, services revenue is X divided by subscribers equals Y. And you can use that. I don't use that particularly. I keep my model with Apple very simple because my thesis is very simple, that services revenue continues to grow, just like a subscription business from Adobe or something like that, where you just see price increases and you see a number of users growing.
All right, Owen. So at the time of recording, late 2022, Apple have just reported and numbers were a little bit soft. So we're not going to talk specifics in terms of the number here, but generally where do you see the valuation of Apple going? Yeah,
so I guess at a current price, which is around about $140, you could say it's probably fairly valued. Now, I would say that if you look at it, remember we talked about multiples in the last show, where we talked about, and in the first episode, where you could use multiples to try and estimate the value of something, or at least get a sense. Apple's price earnings ratio is actually lower than both Microsoft and Netflix. Right now, if you think about in context of that, if you just had that as your opportunity set, would you say Apple is higher quality than Microsoft or likely to grow faster than Netflix? Probably grow faster than Netflix, but maybe not Microsoft because of its suite. So we can get a general sense of that and how much we'll be willing to pay. I would say about 20 to 25 times for a business like Apple is good, because you can actually remove the cash that it's in the business because that's not part of the business. And you get to a reasonable figure, in the high teens. I think that's a reasonable price to pay for a business of this quality. And consider that the average ASX company trades at around about 15 times price earnings ratio. So you're not paying that much more for the world's biggest and maybe one of the best brands in the world that can compound slowly over time.
All right, Owen. Well, I think if people want to see more of your valuation work, the place to go is the Value Investor Program. They can see it on the Rask website. They can see it on the Equity Mates website. They can see it in the show notes. Honestly, you can't escape it. It's everywhere. There's also a free course, the Get Started Investing course, if people want to do that as well. Wherever you are in your investing journey, it's worth refreshing your knowledge. But Owen, something you said pricked my ears up earlier in this episode. You said I modeled it and then I returned to it every 6 to 12 months. It just made me think, how many of these models have you got? How many companies do you have models for that you're refreshing, once a year, twice a year? And can I access your hard drive?
Yeah, so we use Google Drive and Notion to do all these. So a lot of them are there, and you can just update them very quickly. In the course itself, there's 5 solid reports as models. So you can access them, and they'll be updated regularly, like every 6 months. But in terms of my own, I probably have floating around in the ether probably 50 to 100 models just somewhere. Wow. But how many do I actually keep tabs on very closely and very intimately? It'd be no more than 20. It's probably 10 to 20. Because most companies don't make it to modeling. Most companies are just simply not in my wheelhouse. I'm not comfortable owning them for whatever qualitative reason. It's not worth me putting in, 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours building a new model from scratch for one of those companies. So, to your point, Ren, time is valuable. Don't waste your time with companies getting to modeling if you're not ever going to invest in them.
Love it. Well, if you want access to those 4 or 5 models in the course, equitymates.com/online-courses, it'll be in the show notes, as well as our discount code MATES, which gets you $100 off the price of the course. Great. But Owen, thank you so much for that, for the last 3 episodes. Learn a lot, as I'm sure members of both of our communities have as well. Always a pleasure chatting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Owen.
You have been listening to an Equity Mates Media production. In the spirit of reconciliation, Equity Mates Media acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. This podcast is intended for education and entertainment purposes. Any advice is general advice only and has not taken into account your personal financial circumstances, needs, or objectives. Before acting on general advice, you should consider if it is relevant to your needs and read the relevant product disclosure statement. And if you're unsure, please speak to a financial professional. The hosts of this podcast and their guests may have positions in the companies mentioned. Equity Mates Media operates under an Australian Financial Services Licence 540697.